A year ago, Jo Cox, a Labour MP, was murdered by a fascist terrorist in broad daylight. What I'm doing today is I'm going to speak to her widower, Brendan Cox. What I want to talk to Brendan about is Jo herself, what she stood for, what she believed in, and what sort of legacy she should leave behind. How did you get through the initial horror of what happened?
In some ways, the weird thing is having two kids who were 3 and 5 at the time. That was both the hardest part of what happened, but it was also the thing that kept me going. I think if they hadn't been there, I would have just have collapsed and not continued to function. But I knew pretty much immediately as I heard the news that I had to put what I was feeling to one side for the time being and just focus on how do I tell them, how do I make sure that it is as least bad as it possibly can be, given it was going to be a horrific moment that will change the whole of their lives. From a personal point of view, I found it more difficult later on, I guess, because in those first few weeks, it's part autopilot, part you've got a really clear task in terms of keeping your family together, and partly the shock of it. But in the following weeks and the following months, I think the sort of permanence of it is what hits you the hardest, and the fact that there's one of those few situations in your life where there's nothing you can do about it. Every day there's different things, often unexpected things that bring it all back. But I think at the moment I'm still sort of 20% down the road of dealing with it. I still definitely haven't dealt with it in my head.
With your kids now, how do you talk to them about their mum?
So I've spoken to child psychologists a lot, and the advice from them was really clear right from the beginning, which was to be honest with them, to be open with them, to tell them as much as you can, to involve them in whether it's the funeral or the memorials, and make sure that they feel some ownership of it. So I followed their advice as best I can, and the kids, I mean, they've got a lot of Jo spirit in them. They're very feisty, and they still have a sort of enthusiasm and a zest for life, which is still incredibly powerful. And when you're that age, you have a resilience and adaptability, which is amazing to see, which keeps them going. I worry more probably, in 5 years' time, how they'll be doing. But we talk about Jo every day. This morning when I woke up, we were watching videos of her doing various things. And they, so she's a very present part of our life. There's no sort of taboo about talking, every day, every evening, every morning. She's part of the conversation.
How did you meet?
We met when we were both working at Oxfam, and then we started going out together in 2006. And very quickly, I knew that she was the only person I'd ever met that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with.
And what was it, as you got to know, what was it that struck you about the person she was?
What was obvious about Jo when you met her was the energy and enthusiasm, the sort of zest for life. She threw herself at everything. She had a drive and a sort of intensity, but she also mixed that with this a lightness of touch. Like she had a humour. She laughed all the time. That's the whenever I think of Jo, that's the sound I hear of her laughing. I think what defined her was her remarkable level of empathy.
So what were the things she really wanted to champion as a politician, as a member of parliament?
She was very strategic, so we had a sort of year strategy of the things that she wanted to focus on. Top of her list was loneliness. She felt that there was this sort of loneliness crisis which had a governmental dimension to it, and there needed to be some policies around, but also was a sort of social issue that we all need to get better at addressing. So that was very high on her agenda. Syria was the thing that she probably spoke most about in Parliament, where she felt that there is a collective failure to engage with it on a serious basis. It got kicked around too much as a political football in the UK, as opposed to the humanitarian crisis that it was, and that there wasn't people seriously wrestling with what is a horrific crisis and continues to be a horrific crisis. So she wanted to put that more front and centre. And then there were a series of other issues like getting more women into public life, autism, a set of other issues that she worked on as well, but those were the main ones.
Many would argue today that this country is more bitterly divided than at any point since the end of World War II. Isn't any attempt now to unite this country futile? We're just too bitterly divided now.
I'm not sure we're as bitterly divided as the narrative suggests. I think if you look at the public discourse, and the media and politics to an extent. Certainly, like division is absolutely everywhere. But I don't think that represents most people. I think, you know, most people aren't like you or I. They don't sort of live in the sort of thinking about politics a lot of the time. And I don't think that people feel that they hate each other, depending on how they voted in Brexit. Of course, a few people do, and there's, you know, angry extremes who I think are increasingly vocal. But I think the vast majority of people, maybe this stuff takes up 2 or 3% of their headspace at most. We need to be careful about internalising a narrative of division when I think, as Jo talked about, in fact, there's far more things that we have in common.
Do you worry that sometimes, you know, in the media, politicians often, they do try to sometimes to try and focus not just on what divides us, but to kind of exacerbate those divisions to some degree?
I think what's happening across, not just in the UK but across Europe, is that there's a set of insecurities which are making people feel vulnerable. And that's economic securities because of globalisation and the changing ways that we work. It's sort of physical insecurity and people's concern about terrorism in particular. And then it's also this sort of cultural insecurity about the fact our high streets are changing or the way we look as a country is changing. And there's two responses to that. One is to try and focus on those issues and figure out how you address them. And the other is to blame another group and to say this is all the fault of the Brexiteers or the Remainers or the migrants or the Muslims or the Mexicans in the case of Trump, everybody in the case of Trump. We have to take on and resist those who are building that narrative of otherness. The rhetoric of people like Trump, Le Pen and others emboldens those people to think it's okay and that's part of, you know, that's an acceptable part of society. And so that's what we need to try and shift. I think politics should be full of passion, it should be full of vigorous debate, and we should actively disagree with each other and take each other on, but there shouldn't be a role for hate in it. And I think when it tips over into hating the other, that's where we need to draw the line, and we need to take those people on and marginalise them.
One of the most widespread forms of prejudice today is anti-Muslim prejudice. How do you think, practically, we can overcome that kind of bigotry?
Anti-Islamic sentiment is now, if you like, the sort of the poster child of otherness. Obviously that's against a backdrop where there is a tiny minority of Islamist-inspired extremists who play into the hands of those who want to then castigate an entire community. I think what needs to happen in order to address that is actually what happened in the response to the Westminster attack. There were a few shrill voices who were saying, you know, this is Islam or this is, but actually the vast majority of people and the vast media reaction, and actually, to be fair, the vast majority of the political action, was that this was the action of an extremist, and this extremist and this extremism needs to be tackled. And the best way we do that is we do that together. We do that by bringing communities together rather than blaming communities. And that, I felt, was a really strong visceral reaction. Those voices who were arguing it was the fault of all Muslims were really sort of on the margins. They were left doing sort of Fox News. I also think we need to get much better at letting people ask the uncomfortable questions, because I think a lot of the worries about Islam and some of this Islamophobia comes from people not knowing enough about it, not experiencing it. So, you know, if you look at the areas where it's highest, it's areas where you have least interaction. You're most likely to fear a Muslim if you don't know a Muslim. It's the same with every other demographic group. I think one of the things that liberals have made a mistake of is whenever there's any questioning, there's a sort of jumping down the throat and assuming that it's hatred and bigotry, whereas sometimes it's just legitimate questioning, and people have to go through that process of understanding. We need to encourage people to go through that process of understanding. I think that needs to be coupled with a uncompromising stance to those who are actively promoting hatred. That is not okay. It's completely legitimate to have debates about the role of Islam in society, about Sharia courts, about whatever else, but driving hatred against a group isn't acceptable. And I think if we have a clearer, united and strong front against that, it pushes that to the margins, it opens up the space for legitimate questioning and debate, and it increases people's comfort levels. Do
you think it's a sense sometimes that those two forms of extremism feed off each other? Are they kind of...
Not only do they feed off each other, but they are each other. The sort of far right white nationalist and the sort of Islamist, they have the same basic belief that people of difference can't live together. We have a duty to show, actually, yes we can, yes we do. It's the same instinct that we need to take on, and we need to defeat both of those things.
In terms of refugees, I'd put it to you, there is very, very little support for taking more refugees in this country. Do you accept that? And what can be done to change that?
The thing which has reduced people's confidence in our ability to accept refugees or migrants is, one, the sort of process. Like, it feels chaotic, it feels unfair, it feels like it's out of control. And then secondly, that it's merged with a lot of the sort of social pressures of doctors' waiting lists or school waiting lists, etc., which is actually predominantly a question about underfunding public services rather than about the impact of refugees, but those two things get merged. I also think we need to get much better at telling the stories, not just of why people left and why they've come, but the examples of integration. One of the mistakes we make too often is that we talk about difference and diversity, and we stop there. And the fascinating thing, this is what Jo talked about in her maiden speech, is with all that difference and diversity, actually how much commonality there is, and we're very bad at talking about that. So talking about the examples of refugees who have then gone on and set up factories, or refugees who have then gone on to be a core part of their local communities, like, we have to tell that story much better.
The Great Get-Together will take place on the weekend, obviously the anniversary of Jo's death, 16th, 17th. What exactly is it? And what kind of events would you like to see take place?
The idea is very simple. We're asking people to get together with their neighbours, share food with their neighbours, and celebrate what we have in common. And people are running with that in all weird and wonderful ways. We've got, I think, 105,000 events so far that we're aware of, and we're not aware of all of them. I wanted to remember Jo in the way that she lived and what sort of personified who she was, that energy, the community spirit, the enthusiasm, passion for life, and not just a sort of mournful fixation on how she died. Like, I wanted that balance. And then secondly, it also felt like, you know, Jo's killing was designed to tear communities apart, and an anniversary that brought communities together felt like the best possible response and riposte. So what I hope it is in all instances is something that people enjoy doing. Like, this isn't supposed to be a sort of worthy thing that we sort of drag out of people. I hope this is an opportunity that people seize to bring their communities together. And then secondly, I hope it makes it easier to do it again, because I think one of the things about being British is that we love the sense of closer communities. We love the sense of knowing our neighbours. We want our kids to be able to play with our kids down the street. But that doesn't just happen. We have to work at it, and we need an excuse. We need an excuse to knock on the door. And so we hope that the Great Get-Together will be that excuse. One of the things I hope it starts to at least contribute towards is a sense of changing that narrative of division. I don't think that narrative represents really where people are. And I think showing that and giving people opportunities to come together and celebrate togetherness, I hope will start to change some of that national mood as well.
How would you like people watching to remember Jo?
I'd like you to remember her for what she was, which was this incredible, energetic, enthusiastic, and empathetic sort of ball of energy, and who always responded to a problem with a question about what we can do. And I hope that in response to all the questions that we're facing at the moment, we ask ourselves not just what the problem is, but what we can do about it. And I think if we do that, we make our country a better place to live in.
It's impossible not to be moved by that. And you know what? Brendan's absolutely right. That terrorist attempted to incite hatred. He was driven by hatred, but he's failed, because the legacy of Jo Cox will be to bring people closer together, to confront hatred and overcome it. And that, I think, is something which I know Brendan, well, he must be very proud of in terms of what he's achieved, what Jo's achieved. But I think all of us have a duty and a responsibility to honour that legacy ourselves. That's what the Great Get-Together is all about. So I want to hear your ideas. What are you going to get up to that weekend? What plans have you got? Do share them, share suggestions. How can we overcome the divisions that exist? You know, I do think on the ground, Brendan's right, we're not as divided as people say in the press, but those divisions are there. How do we overcome them? So as ever, thanks for watching. Please subscribe. I'll see you next time.